So I was under the impression it's mostly winter garden prep. So I'm going to hit on a little bit of everything. So it's going to look at landscapes. We're going to look a little bit about lawns. We're going to look at some of the vegetable things too. So it's going to be a little bit of everything. So I probably wrote it down wrong. When you get my age, you get forgetful on what you're going to talk about. But luckily, I finished this at 4:30 this afternoon. So this is going to be fantastic. So we're going to kind of jump into it. Can y'all see? Let me minimize that so you can see a little bit more of some of the pictures and things. So y'all on the plateau are a little bit different, but the most part, Middle Tennessee is zone 7A. When you look at Memphis, they're pretty much zone 8. And when you go all the way up to East Tennessee, up into the Tri-City areas, they can be pretty much zone 5 anymore. But last year, we had this crazy Arctic blast that came through the third week of December, and it kept temperatures down below 32 for 5 days. What was interesting is that most plants that we've had for years, our hollies, our Leland cypress, our laurels, it wiped them out. And it wasn't the sheer cold, it was actually the sudden drop in temperature. So that Wednesday, we were sitting at 60 degrees that third week of December. And then Thursday morning, when I got up, my thermometer said -1. And it was rough. We saw plants that just weren't used to that. And then we saw like this holly here, the leaves just got desiccated. They dropped off. They still had a lot of sap and fluid in their leaves. Then the winds came through for 5 days and desiccated them, and it completely dried them out. We saw plants get affected by last winter that we've never really had issues with. Our average extreme minimum temperature is anywhere from 0 to 5. Our average rainfall can be around 49 to 52 inches. The last couple of years, we've been sitting close to 70 inches on rainfall. But for Tennessee, when we're looking at some of the things in the winter garden, we see things burn, some of these broadleaf evergreens, such as this laurel. We saw some of the things that we've kind of skirted the hardiness on, such as on the right here, this is a plant called Distilium. And I really like this plant as a landscape shrub. I was going to kind of tout it as an alternative to laurels, skip laurels and autoleucon laurels. Well, last December, that freeze wiped them out here in Wilson County. We saw Lelands turn completely brown. Some of them came back and some of them completely died. So in our areas, we saw some plants that kind of skirted the hardiness that were just a little bit warmer than others. So we have these areas called microclimates around our homes. Sometimes they're around buildings or maybe around trees where the temperature is just a little bit warmer because our homes give off heat. The concrete, the roadway gives off heat. Sometimes plants even give off heat in the wintertime. So we saw, that's a picture of a fig. We saw everybody's fig in Wilson County get completely wiped out. Can y'all still, let me exit that so you can see it. Maybe that looks a little bit better. So the first thing we always recommend, and I'm sure Dr. Bowling has said it a couple of weeks ago, you need to test your soil. And I think the ideal time to test it is at the end of fall, sometime in the end of winter. And I'm going to go through just soil testing for just a little bit. You get higher fertilizer efficiency. Now, my mother, there's no changing her mind. She's going to put the same amount of 6-12-12 on her beans, on her corn, on her tomatoes every year, even though probably she doesn't even need it. If she went through a test and tested for phosphorus and potassium, I would say that my mother has a real large garden. I would say it's out of sight how much phosphorus and potassium is there. So theoretically, she's kind of wasting money on that. The other things why we test our soil is more balanced nutrient levels for crops. Sometimes certain crops need certain things. They may need calcium. They may need boron. They may need some iron. And that soil test will tell us. And it's not a guesswork. It's really hard when someone calls my office and they say, Lucas, I've got 4 apple trees, or I've got a fescue lawn. What should I fertilize it with? And I usually respond with, I just don't know. And that usually kind of shocks them a little bit because I don't know what's in their soil. I don't know what their pH is. We had a homeowner who tested his lawn last week, and he's got a really large lawn. And he said, Lucas, by the time I did the math, it was 1 ton of lime to raise the pH up enough for my fescue to actually do something. And that's probably why some of his fescue was suffering. He wanted to get a soil test to see. And soil testing, just to kind of talk about it really quickly, it only tests in our lab for nutrients only. We don't test for diseases. Sometimes people will call about diseases in their lawn or their landscape. and they'll say, I just want to see what's killing my shrubs. That's not what our soil test does. Our soil test is just checking for nutrients only. It's going to tell you what to add to your lawn, your vegetable garden, your landscape, your fruits, your vegetables, whatever, and then when to apply it. It's pretty cut and dry, but if you don't understand it, be sure to reach out to your extension agent. When the ideal time is now to do it. And I've got a box full in my car of hay and soil samples that I'm taking to a meeting tomorrow to try to drop off because everybody's doing it. Our soils are kind of dry. It kind of looks like Wilson County's under a 40% chance of rain tomorrow and Thursday, so it may not be a good weekend to do it. If I was going to soil test, I would have probably done it today. We need to do it now so we have enough time for the additives to actually work. If you use some of these granular limes, they can take up to 2 years to actually raise the pH up to what is recommended on the soil test. So on lime, you've got a bunch of different types. You've got the powdered lime, which works a lot quicker, but some of the granular limes, which are easier to apply with a broadcast spreader, take a long time to work. It's not a quick one and done situation. I think that's one of the biggest frustrations of homeowners when they call. I'm going to swap mosquitoes as I talk, is that they want it to work quickly. They may test for soil for blueberries, then they'll go through, add it, wait a month and test it again, and they'll see there's really not much done to it yet. Now, how often should we test our soil? Lawns and gardens, pretty much every 3 years. High value crops, if you're a blueberry farmer, a peach crop, we have some farmers here in the county, strawberries, peaches, blueberries, raspberries, blackberries. Now, they're ones to go through and test it every year. Row crops, and it goes back to every 2 to 3 years. And if you've never done a soil test, and I know we hear people say, extension agents always say, get a soil test, get a soil test. It is true. 6 inches down from 8 to 10 locations of the area using a shovel or a probe. And most of our offices have some of the equipment. If you needed a soil probe to go pull 8 or 10 plugs from your lawn or your vegetable garden, it's the easiest to do that. Select a 1-inch strip and remove any rocks, trash, organic matter, etc. And it should be no significant difference in the area. So a homeowner came in today and he said, I need 6 soil boxes. And I said, wow, 6 soil boxes. And I said, how big's your lawn? He said, what's a 1/4 acre? I said, well, more than likely, you're only going to need 1 soil test, because if it's less than 10 acres, the soil's pretty much the same unless there's a significant difference in rocky versus pasture, shady versus sunny, or hilly versus flat. So like looking at this pasture right here, this pasture was about 7 acres, and this was on a different property that we used to own. And then you go through and test the soil and you zigzag it back and forth through the field. You don't take them all from the same area. And then you put them all in the same bucket and mix them up. 6 inches down, that kind of shows you. Those soil probes on the left are actually in a lot of our offices, and you can check them out. But I'm sure all of you gardeners have shovels at home. You can do the same thing. This is kind of showing that zigzag pattern for just a basic soil test if you're wanting to do that, less than 10 acres. Put them all in the same bucket, mix it up. We always recommend a plastic bucket as opposed to a galvanized bucket. Mix the soil together, remove everything, and you only really need, I need to change that, about 2 cups of dry soil. Sometimes people will come in, the boxes have changed sizes over the past couple of years. Sometimes people will come in with just a really small amount of soil, not enough to really fill the bottom of a coffee cup. And we'll always try to explain that we need a lot more than that. So in the wintertime, it was always a practice for gardeners around here to go through and put manure all over their garden, or maybe manure all over their lawns. And I'll talk about that too. We've seen some hiccups with people using manures now, and I wanted to hit on this really fast. So if you're the kind of person that would always go to your neighbor's cattle barn or horse barn, scrape off all the manure and just apply it over to your garden in the fall time, because that's what we grew up doing. I had an uncle in the chicken business in Overton County, and we would just go get chicken litter and put it all over our garden every year. That's just what we did. That was our kind of organic matter for the garden. Some of the manures are carrying a residue from some of the newer hay sprays for weeds. So they spray the weeds in the hay field. It actually passes through the cow, through the horse, stays in the manure about 2 years. So when you take that manure that was fed some of that, it's called aminopyrrolid, Grazon, Duracor, Surmount, Seemed like there's another one that came out now. When you take that manure, spray it all over your garden, you've just killed your garden for a couple of years. So you can't do that really anymore. So the question we get now is, how can we test that manure? Really, there's no test that the university can do to show you that, hey, this has aminopyrrolase, this has herbicides in it. I always try to tell people, get some of it, mix it with some soil, and plant some beans in it. If the beans grow and they're not twisted or gnarly, they're probably fine. If the beans never grow, then there's probably some herbicide residue and you shouldn't put it on your garden. The fall time is the ideal time to plant trees and shrubs, perennials in the landscape, because a lot of these things are about to go dormant. We don't have to water them theoretically for about the next 6 months because we're probably going to get enough ample rainfall. But the biggest hiccup is people have got to properly plant these things. This was taken at a bank here in Wilson County a couple of years ago. And we always plant things in rows for some reason. This bank had planted these huge red maples up and down along the street because they wanted them all the same color in the fall time. Well, obviously, and of course, the middle largest maple tree died. So they called me and they said, can you just come look at our maple tree? We want to figure out why it's dying. I said, that's fine. I'll come do that. So when I went over, all I did was dug around, and the landscaper had left the straps around the bottom of it. If you're planting trees, if you're planting shrubs in the landscape, now's a great time to do it. A lot of our nurseries just don't carry this stuff, so you may have to run to McMill or some of the larger nurseries. But make sure you plant them properly on bald and burlap trees and shrubs. Make sure you cut that string that's wrapped around the base of that tree, and that's been the biggest hiccup with these things. When you're planting some of these smaller trees and shrubs in the landscape, they more than likely will not ever need to be strapped down tight. So this homeowner had a bunch of, they're called purple leaf sand cherries up and down their driveway, and they had them so tight to the ground, but they really weren't able to grow. It was so tight, and I'm not sure. I could have played music on those strings. They were that tight. It doesn't look that tight in this picture. But it was interesting as I went through and I said, why did you do that? And she said, well, I just thought they needed it. And no lie, the trees were only about 6 feet tall. And I said, I would go through and cut all those off. I said, those trees probably don't need that anymore. Now I can see strapping down trees when they're maybe a 12 or 14 foot tall tree, which is usually a 3 or 4 inch caliper bald and burlap tree. I can see that sometimes because those trees don't have any roots. But we can't have them tight when we're doing that in the landscape, because that tree, when we eventually cut those off, that tree is not going to be used to wind at all. You've got to be able to leave them enough gap in those strings to sway back and forth some in the wind. Make sure you plant these things properly. And I'm going to show pictures of my kids because that's what we do. We goof outside all the time. So make sure you plant things properly. Make sure you're actually planting the ball, the container, whatever it is, level with the surface of the soil. And don't make just a perfect round circle. Go through and take your shovel and kind of make juts along the side of the circle. I know your soils are probably perfect in all your other counties on the Cumberland Plateau. We have clay in Wilson County. I know you guys don't deal with that. You don't understand the struggles that we have with clay. If I make a perfectly round circle in my lawn out here, and then I pour water in it, in some places in my lawn, that water is still going to be there in a couple of days. That's how bad it is in some places in Wilson County. Make sure you kind of jut it so the water can kind of seep through. If you just make a complete circle that's really, really smooth, that's going to be a great place for root rot to set in after some rains. Let me encourage you to get your kids outside too. I'm going to go on a rant really fast. The average 8-year-old today spends anywhere from 4 to 6 minutes outside anymore. That's the new average for the 6 to 8-year-olds spending outside. But they're also spending about 8 hours a day in front of a screen. If your kids are able to go outside and garden, go outside, play in the driveway with you, throw a ball, do something outside, get your kids outside. Be a smart shopper when it comes to this winter time. Seed catalogs know when to send you their seed catalogs because you have seasonal affective disorder. You're sad from the wintertime. When you see these seed catalogs, you come in and you start buying all sorts of things. And then when you see everything that you bought, you're not really in a good mood after you see the bill on some of that stuff. Find factual information. Let me encourage you to go to uthort.com and then Tennessee Turfgrass Weeds, which is the Tennessee Turf Group. They have some fantastic growing guides on there because everybody is seeding their fescue lawns right now. We kind of have a small window to do that. It was really interesting. Dr. Tom Samples, a couple of years ago, he was teaching a class in Wilson County, and he said the first best time, or the best time to plant fescue lawn is September. The second best time to plant a fescue lawn is September of the next year. It's just not going to work in the springtime. It's not going to work in October because we theoretically will start getting some frost around Halloween. Go to the trial gardens, go to the university gardens websites. Local nurseries can be good or bad. We see these nurseries still promoting a lot of plants that can be iffy. We see them kind of talk about some plants that are invasive and selling things. I want to encourage you to find some good nurseries. I get nervous when I go to a nursery and I see crepe myrtle and the tag will say pink. Well, there's 100 varieties of pink crepe myrtle, so I don't really know how big that one's going to get. If you're looking for trees and shrubs for the lawn, for your landscape, let me encourage you to find this book, The Manual of Woody Landscape Plants by Michael Durr. It is the woody guru of all things trees and shrubs. Watch for insects and diseases. And when you buy plants, and I know some of you gardeners are this way, you automatically go to Lowe's or Home Depot or any garden center, and you go to the back of the store, and you find those plants that are 25 cents or 50 cents. And I know some of you do that because I do that. I did that yesterday at Lowe's. Sometimes those plants are carrying root rot. They're carrying Pythium. They're carrying Rhizoctonia. They're carrying some of these insects, mealybug, scale, aphid. So when you pay 25 cents for some of these diseased or dying plants, and you bring them back to your house with the mindset, I can save it, that's a terrible choice. Don't do that. Just really look them over if you're going to go to the back of the store and look for the cheapest thing. Now, I'm going to tell this story. So this was a tomato a couple years ago. It was really touted really nicely in seed catalogs. And I picked up the plants. I found them. This was called Buffalo Sun. All the seed catalogs had it maybe 2 years ago. And it says, great flavor, great production. Boy, that thing grew really well. Beautiful tomatoes. But it tasted just like eating a piece of wood. It really didn't have any flavor. It's good to try new things, but that thing did not work out for me. When you go to the garden centers and you see things that are diseased, and you think maybe I can cut that off and get rid of it. And this is actually a canker that gets on red and yellow twig dogwoods. It's always going to happen. If it's already in the plant, it's already systemic. It's running through the whole system of the plant. Don't do that. Boxwood blight. If you're buying landscape shrubs, boxwood blight was first found in Tennessee at a box store in McMinnville. And what's McMinnville known for? That's the nursery capital of the world. It shut down. So Dr. Fulya Basel-Garel, who's kind of the nursery pathologist down there, it was on a Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, and she got that call, and she had to go in and start testing all these things. We see this. It's getting to be a little bit more regular. So if you go to the back of the store and you're buying boxwoods and you see black lesions on the stems, black lesions on the leaf, it could potentially be boxwood blight. Leave it there for some other person to get it. In the wintertime, it's kind of mixed feelings on sanitation in the garden. You see different things on Facebook promoting leave the leaves. Now, I'm going to talk about both sides of it because I'm on the fence. First, if you suffered from leaf spot cercospora, if you suffered from powdery mildew, if you suffered from some diseases, fungal diseases on the leaf or the stem or the fruit, that stuff overwinters in this foliage that's all over the ground. If you had that, I would rake it up and get rid of it because you don't want it to just constantly cycle. If you did not have any problems whatsoever with any leaf spot diseases, I would leave that because we're seeing research show that a lot of our native pollinators are actually overwintering in these leaves now. So my biggest hiccup, I raise a lot of daylilies, and daylilies are in the ground. Some of them are evergreen and some of them are dormant. They go completely below the ground. But what's the worst hiccup I'm having with them? I leave the leaves for a while for the most part in the wintertime, and then in the middle of winter, I'll go open up the foliage and look, all that brown leaves. Well, aphids are overwintering now in these daylilies, so I've been starting ripping those up because I've had the worst aphid time problem on some of my daylilies. I go through after a couple of months sometime in the middle of winter and clean them all up just to try to kill those aphids from exposing them to whatever February is going to have. So we see fungal diseases on a lot of vegetables in our garden. This stuff can overwinter in old plant debris. I'm a little sweaty because I was telling Chris a minute ago, I had a little bit of sunlight, so I started ripping out all my tomato cages from the garden. Does anybody know what this leaf spot disease is on tomato? You got a black dot and you got these little bitty rings inside the dot.
No.
What is that?
No, I don't know.
Oh, okay. That is actually early blight. So early blight can overwinter itself. So we see some people leave all their tomato debris on top of the soil, on top of the ground. That's not a good practice if you had a lot of leaf diseases, late blight, early blight. Southern blight's actually in the soil. So if you get a chance, clean them up. Now I took this picture in my garden just a few months ago. So I get it every year. So I try to clean off all the debris and then I turn it under. And then I actually plant a cover crop, which we'll talk about cover crops in just a second. Learn in the wintertime. Wintertime can be really depressing to a gardener. Learn about some of these newer bugs that are coming down the pipeline. Crepe myrtle bark scale, I'm going to show you pictures of that in a second. Spotted lanternfly is actually a newer pest that's in Virginia, Pennsylvania. It's going to be terrible. We kind of think about when Japanese beetles first came, they were really rough for a few years. Spotted lanternfly is going to be like that, but it's mostly going to affect fruit crops. So I've seen pictures of it. It's a beautiful little bug, but it's a sucking insect. It will get on a grapevine. Excuse me, got the hiccups. A grapevine, and it will land on the grapevine by the hundreds, and they'll suck that grapevine dry. Emerald ash borer is here, and that's the number one reason why you can't bring firewood into state parks anymore. Emerald ash borer overwinters in old ash, but we were going to use for firewood. If you've got a down tree somewhere, if it's an ash tree, more than likely in Middle Tennessee, you've already got ash borer. I know none of you are dealing with stink bugs getting in your house in the wintertime. Stink bugs are really difficult sometimes, and that's probably a big question we get in the wintertime is how do you get rid of stink bugs? You just got to find where they're coming in at and caulk it up. Ambrosia beetle and flathead apple borer, they come in sometimes when trees are stressed out. Now, I mentioned earlier, sometimes when we plant trees and shrubs in the fall, we generally don't have to water them. You may have to water them some. If we go the entire month of November without any rain, I would probably water some of my trees and shrubs because ambrosia beetle will get in on trees if they're a little bit stressed out from water, or maybe a bug has come through, or a leaf spot disease or something. Ambrosia beetle can smell that a tree is stressed out because when a tree's stressed out, it gives off an ethylene gas, and that ambrosia beetle heads straight to that bug or that tree. If you've got ash trees on your property, if they've got D-shaped holes in them, that's the emerald ash borer. It's really easy to spot in the wintertime. If you've got larger trees, a lot of the foliage is gone. You can see the bark a lot better if you've got ash trees on your property. It's a good time to kind of go through, spot your ash trees, mark them now that you know where they are, and then go through in the wintertime, look for those D-shaped holes. Now, I mentioned crepe myrtle bark scale. We saw it in Wilson County about 7 years ago. It was first spotted in Memphis about 10 years ago by Dr. Chris Cooper. So crepe myrtle bark scale overwinters itself on crepe myrtles. And I'm sure if you've got a landscape, you probably have some crepe myrtles in your landscape. So it looks like snow all over the bark. So if someone calls me about a crepe myrtle in the wintertime and I drive up to their lawn and I look at that crepe myrtle and looks like snow all over it, I already know that it's the crepe myrtle bark scale. They're overwintering for next year. It's easy to get them off with a power washer, and you can spray the tree with a dormant oil, but we normally recommend a systemic insecticide in the springtime to try to knock it back. They can be a little difficult once they get started, but look in the wintertime for these bugs. That's that ambrosia beetle. We had a maple tree that was dying at a homeowner, and then I found one little hole, and it was about the size of a toothpick at the base of the tree, and it had this sawdust sticking out of it. And the tree had already died. But I don't want you to think that all bugs are bad. So I know I talked about sanitation, cleaning up the leaves. If you've got diseases, if you don't have diseases, it's not I would leave them until the springtime till it gets warm. But please don't have the mindset that all bugs are bad. I took this picture a couple of years ago because I want to talk about, are all bugs bad? And I do this with second graders. And I said, what bug is this? And I always ask parents too. This is squash bug. If you raise squash, pumpkins, zucchini, kabocha squash, spaghetti, butternut, all those, you're going to have squash bugs in Tennessee. We hate this. But is this bug bad? So this bug is actually a Gulf fritillary, which is going to turn into a Gulf fritillary butterfly. This bug looks really ugly and nasty, and when some homeowners see that, they just want to kill it. But that's a really good guy. He turns into a nice little orange butterfly. So please don't have the mindset that all bugs are bad. We use bugs sometimes. So it's interesting today. I did some fire ant demonstrations with Dr. Karen Vale in our county with county maintenance staff from the schools. And it was interesting because she said we don't normally treat fire ants in row crops because fire ants, we see West Tennessee, that they're actually eating aphids and some of these things that are on some of these row crops now. So fire ants, even though they're awful to deal with, and so we were talking about that earlier today, they can actually have a good place too. Pruning. We've got to put down those pruners after August. And we see tons of landscapers going through shaving everything in the shape of a ball. And I'll talk about that. If we start pruning all of our boxwoods, all of our hollies, they're going to flush out new growth because we're still sitting at 80, 85 degrees during the day. If I go through and shave all my boxwoods into the shape of a box, and then I sit at 85 degrees for a week, that boxwood is going to push out new growth. The last week of October, theoretically, I'm going to get a frost. What's going to happen to that fresh growth on that boxwood, on that holly? It's going to get burnt back because that plant right now is storing up energy. Okay. When you go through, shave it back, it has to use part of its reserved energy to push out new growth. Well, that new growth just got burnt back. Then in the springtime, it has just partial of its stored energy coming back out. So the number one issue we see with boxwoods getting a lot of brown patches, holly's getting a bunch of dead stems inside of them. It's people pruning them in the fall, the holly and the boxwoods using all their reserved energy. And then in the springtime, they don't have enough to push out full growth. Determine the correct species for pruning in the winter. And I'll talk about hydrangeas. We got to quit topping these trees. Quit topping trees. When I think about hydrangeas, some hydrangeas bloom on old wood and some hydrangeas bloom on new wood. And what I mean by that is if I take a hydrangea that blooms on new wood and I prune it in the middle of wintertime, it is not going to affect the flowers at all because that hydrangea, like this one shown, is going to form its flower buds in the next year, April, May, June. You'll start seeing them come up. If I talk about the hydrangea macrophylla types, that M is supposed to be lowercase, they generally bloom on old wood. So what they do right now, they're actually forming their flower buds. So if you go through and prune all those dead looking sticks in the wintertime, you will never have flowers on that hydrangea. Now I put generally there because we have some newer forms called twist and shout, endless summer, summer crush that bloom on new wood. But I wanted to keep you in mind, you can prune some of these in the wintertime and they're fine. So like limelight, little lime, bobo, some of the more common ones that we're seeing, which we call the paniculatas, and the arborescens, which are the old Annabelle hydrangeas. After all the leaves are gone in the middle of winter, we normally encourage you to do it in late winter, sometime February, March. You can prune those things back. Now, little lime, And limelight hydrangea, you can prune those things back to 3 feet every year and they would be fine. Here's an example of boxwood burn, winter burn, where a homeowner went through. They pruned all their boxwoods. They flushed out growth in November. Well, they got killed back. But the homeowner was convinced that they had boxwood blight. That they had boxwood blight in the middle of winter. And I said, well, let me just come look. And I told her, I said, ma'am, this is nothing you can do. And she said, I just want all the brown to go away. Well, you're going to have to look at it for a couple of months, because in this case, we probably need to leave it there and not try to prune it. Sometimes when we prune plants, they'll try to grow again on some of these warmer days. And if you've been in Tennessee long enough, you know we can sit on Christmas Day in shorts on our porch. And then the next week, January the 1st, we could have 8 inches of snow. Plants are not used to that. Quit topping these trees. This was a magnolia, a southern magnolia. A lady had a landscaper prune for her. It was really butchered. I was actually there for something else, but it really was a terrible job on pruning a southern magnolia in the middle of summertime. We see people come through in the middle of winter and they prune their crepe myrtles back. They bloom on new wood. Cutting back ruins the sculptural form. And if you want a short one, just get a short one. So we've got some newer crepe myrtles, especially these dark foliage ones, that they stay really short. But the biggest complaint, people will call and they'll say, I just want a red crepe myrtle. All right, you go to the garden center, you go to the box store, and you see all sorts of different red crepe myrtles. And we always tell people, well, find the one that fits the size that you want. If you want a huge red crepe myrtle, get Dynamite. If you want one that's a little bit shorter, get Red Rocket. And if you want a really, really short red crepe myrtle, get Red Rooster. That way you're not having to prune them constantly. So if I had a Dynamite crepe myrtle and I planted it 5 feet from my house, and I went through every year and I had to cut that thing back, I'm not into that. I'm a lazy gardener. I don't want to have to do that all the time. But I see people prune these plants wrong all the time. This was gray owl juniper. It's a big, kind of a native type juniper. Beautiful foliage, but they kind of shave it into these box shapes. Trimming the ends of these, this was, I think, a flowering cherry tree. And there was no call for this. No call for shaving these knockouts into the shape of a box. I've seen every landscape shrub shaved into a box now, and it's really disappointing to see that. Hollies, plant a cover crop this winter. If you've got kids, get your kids outside and plant. It's a really fun activity to give a 3-year-old a 5-pound bag of turnip green seeds and just watch them plant it all over the place. So cover crops are really good for the soil. I don't like to see bare ground at all in the garden. I like to see something on top of it, because if we have bare ground, if we get one of those 8-inch snows in the wintertime, we're going to lose some of our topsoil. If we have some of these massive winds that we're going to have, some of these tornadoes that have come through Middle Tennessee in the past few years, it's going to blow away some of our good topsoil. So some of our common cover crops that we see in the fall are radish, oats, wheat, clover, turnips, annual ryegrass. Now, some of these, you really got to research on how to kill these things out. Some of them you can go through, like on the radish. I mean, I do turnips, so that picture before was us planting turnips last year. I plant turnips over my entire garden, and Chris was talking earlier, he plants mustard greens. Mustard greens, you can eat them, but I'm not a fan of them. I grew up eating turnip greens. I'm from the South. Everybody needs to have a turnip green patch in Tennessee if you're a Tennessean. It's good to add organic matter back into the soil. You can go through, plant turnip greens all over your whole garden, turn it back under, and you've just added a ton of great organic matter back to the garden. Now with turnips, you've got 2 types. You've got 7-top and you've got purple top. If you go to your co-op today, that's going to be the only 2 they have. Purple top yields the little bulbs. 7-top actually has the leaves on top of it. So I want to encourage you, if you want turnips, go ahead and plant turnip greens. Now, annual ryegrass, if you plant that as a cover crop, it can be difficult to kill. We see Marshall and Freya. That's some of the more common ryegrasses that we see. But it is a beautiful ryegrass that goes all over the top of the garden or whatever you're planting. Clover is something that we see people use a lot of, and we generally can plant a lot of these clovers in the wintertime. Some people will frost seed them in. They'll put them on top of snow or something like that. Wheats and oat, they're grain crops. So some people will go through, and I've seen there's some watermelon producers that will go through in Arkansas, plant it, and then they'll go through when it's seeding and they'll mow it down. So they've got this really nice patch of weed control in the middle of winter, because a lot of us probably use straw in our garden for weed control. And then go through and plant some of these tillage radishes also. So we have a lot of one of our row crop farmers here. He does a lot of soybeans in the wintertime. He plants a whole mixture of some of the different cabbages, the radishes, the oats, and the wheats, the clovers, the turnips. It's a big cover crop mixture that he uses for his entire soybean field. He has someone come in with a helicopter and spread it all over the place. That stuff is adding organic matter back, because every time we take something from our garden and we're not adding it back, we're just taking nutrients from the garden, and this stuff would add back nutrients. All of these things also are a great way to add back organic matter, because I'm sure, and I talked about earlier, we've all got clay. If you till clay a whole lot of times, it clots up. If you till it when it's really dry, it just dries the bone. It could just turn to a dust. But we want to see soil to be dark. We want to see it kind of be loamy. We don't want to see it turn into dust, and we don't want to see it turn into bricks. The worst thing you can add to a garden is sand, because people will call and they'll say, I've got all clay. I want to add sand to increase the drainage in my garden. If you take clay and you take sand and you mix it together really wet, and then you let it really get dry, you've made bricks. That's what bricks essentially are, is sand and clay. We need to mix those things together. The biggest thing that we need to do in the fall time, if you can find them, is to divide your spring bulbs. If you've got daffodils, if you've got tulips, if you've got hyacinths, now is the time that you actually dig them and divide them, because they haven't established any roots or anything like that. And these were some of the daffodils I had last year. Now, we divide spring bulbs generally whenever they start to wane in flower production. So you may see these old homesteads where the home is gone, where the barn is gone, but they've still got clods of daffodils in the field. Well, you may see flowers on the outside edge, but the whole center of it, there's nothing left. On this property that I've got now, it's really interesting because there's tons of them going up and down the driveway. So the previous homeowner lined their driveway with daffodils, but now it's been about 7 or 8 years and they're starting to kind of wane in production. Finding them, like I said, is the biggest hiccup. If you're able to go through, mark where those clots are with a little flag. I see people use metal stakes sometimes in the garden. You can see that middle picture. I've got metal stakes where my daffodils are because I'm really particular about the names on them. I want to know what the names are. So the little metal stakes that I've got, and they're called paw labels. You can put the name of the daffodil there. One of the bigger things that we're seeing people do in the wintertime is starting a compost pile. We throw away an enormous amount of organic matter that can be added back to our garden. Now, a couple of things that we talk about, you see people talk about adding browns and greens. Now, there is a specific ratio that you need to use. Now, there's a lot of data. I'm not going to give you a specific ratio because it's when you read online, there's different ratios for everything. But let me encourage you to start something this winter. Composting is a great way to do it. We're starting to see schools do this now because some of the kids are starting to catch on to it. I taught high school for about 10 years, and I used to drive a bus for a lot of these school clubs and things. And one of these school clubs went to a camp, and it was kind of an environmental type camp, but they had different bins. And one bin was just like plastic trash, and then one bin was actually going to be composted. And then they would actually go through and weigh it. So when you went through the food line, you had to go through, only get what you want. So they went through, and we kind of saw that the kids each day were more conscious about what they were eating. Starting a compost pile, you do have to kind of give it a little bit of good soil, that clay that you got, which has the microbes in it. Throw it in there, go ahead and wet it down and let it get started. We see them usually generally left open to Mother Nature because we want to kind of see the temperature fluctuations for which is the natural daily or day temperatures and things like that. We want to see natural rainfall get on it, and we want some of these worms, grub worms and things to actually get in it and start breaking this stuff down. The biggest hiccup with a compost pile is it can attract animals. So we always encourage you not to put eggshells and not to put meat in there, because sometimes with meat and eggshells we can get some E. coli, salmonella, and things like that. But it can also bring in some of these scavengers, these detritivores. I think about raccoons and possums and things digging everything up. It's difficult to try to do that inside. If you had a little bin, sometimes it may be best to start it in a small bucket and every night take it out. If your house is anything like ours, we've got a ton of vegetables where we kind of stripped the garden of everything in the past week. We picked all the beans and everything. Well, we're getting a few gnats in the house. I don't know, but gnats seem really bad this year. Try to leave all that stuff outside. Don't start your compost pile inside your kitchen and leave it there for a couple of weeks. Now, I know I didn't really cover lawns that much, Billy, but I wanted to hit on, I thought I was going to talk about just winter garden prep. So if you have any general lawn questions, feel free. I know Dr. Bowling probably did a fantastic job a couple of weeks ago, because I've really been impressed with her so far. Let me stop sharing my screen. That was my contact information.
I didn't have any lawn questions. I'm just here to learn anything and everything, and I appreciate everything you